not as much discussion or sorry, there's not much discussion or support really around how to actually, set those people that are going to be playing a crucial role in the apprentices' jobs up for success, essentially. As realistically, a lot of the apprentices that you are going to be hiring are going to be young people who have never worked before, and it's really important that they have a positive experience, essentially, as it's going to pretty much shape and that attitude towards work very likely for the rest of their lives. So it's a super important topic, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about it today. So just a quick intro to me and what I do before we get into the content. So my name is Shoshanna Davis, and I'm a Gen Z engagement specialist and founder of Fairy Job Mother, which is essentially a platform for over 20,000 young people, which is all about careers and confidence at work. So we provide free and accessible career advice, but on the flip side is also a consultancy where I work very closely with a variety of employers to help them really actually understand their young employees better. I started Fairy Job Mother due to my lack of good and accessible career advice that you're given kind of during and post education. And I was thrown into the working world and really confused about things like figuring out what I wanted to do, how to build my confidence at work, how to build my soft skills and land a promotion. So through the content I share with young people, I'm sharing all of my learned experiences as a young female progressing in the corporate world, combined with the experiences I've developed working directly with young people to help individuals like yourself to really set employees and their managers and leadership teams and everyone involved up for success. So that is just a little bit about me. So now you know who I am, I would love to learn a little bit about who I'm actually talking to today so I can tailor the content as much as possible. So if you wouldn't mind, please could you just drop in the chat what your name is and what you do? And yeah, let's see who we've got here. Okay, so we've got Georgie. We have got Bang Bang, early talent manager. We've got Laura from Not Going to Uni. We've got Jackie White from Barnet Waddington. We've got Nadine, who helps look after engineering apprentices at Roche. Very nice. Oh, we got Fiona. Hello, how are you? We've got Liam, social media and marketing apprentice at 360 Apprenticeships. James, talent and development coordinator. Lisa, L&D manager. Louis, marketing recruitment. Okay, so we've got a real bunch. Oh, we got some more coming through. Georgina, associate director for accountancy. Apprentice manager. Wow. Okay, so we've got lots. We've got a big variety in here. Kind of a variety of different roles, which is really, really good. Yeah, so essentially the content that I'm going to be sharing today is a condensed pretty much version of training that I typically deliver to leadership teams or line managers. So if you are someone that is currently line managing an apprentice, or if you are someone that is looking after apprentices at your organization, I'm hoping this content is going to be relevant to you. So yeah, let's get started essentially. Okay, so first question is, if you could summarize, and I know this is a very loaded question, but if I were to just ask you, and if you were to come up with the first thing that comes into your head in the first 30 seconds, what would you say is your biggest struggle right now with engaging and understanding apprentices at your organization? If you had to kind of pick one struggle, what might that be? And if you could drop that one in the chat too, and let's see what we come up with. Okay, so I can see we've got work ethic. Any others? We've got disconnect between tutors and Gen Z apprentices. Laura said a typical thing she hears is transition from school to workplace. Absolutely. We've got managing young people's expectations at work, which is another common one. Anything else coming through? Okay, let's give it a second. Managing apprentice expectations, getting them to send requests for info back. Okay, that one made me laugh. Cool. Okay, so we've got a wide range of things. So definitely we'll be touching upon some of those. If we don't, there'll definitely be time for questions at the end. And I just saw one more pop through. Apprentices have never been allowed to get things wrong and fail. Yeah, we definitely do touch upon that a little bit. So thank you very much for sharing that one, Martin. So let's get stuck into content. So what we'll be going through today. So we're first going to give a quick intro to Gen Z, who they are and what makes them tick. We'll then touch upon managing an apprentice slash workplace readiness, expectation versus reality. As a lot of the time, we tend to have an expectation of what a young person coming into the organisation may know or what they're likely to know, but a lot of the time the reality of what they actually do know looks pretty different. So we'll be talking through that. We'll then be talking about effectively delivering feedback and setting expectations. And then we'll finally be finishing with some questions at the end, hopefully. So let's get stuck in. So the first thing I guess I just wanted to really bring up is, today's generation of young people is different to yesterday's, right? So here I've got a table of all the different generations. And yeah, so here we've got maturists, we've got baby boomers, we've got Gen Y, and we've got Gen Z. So I guess there are some key differences. Some of the ones that I'd like to pull out upon now. I guess the first one is aspiration, right? So from a job perspective, if we're looking at baby boomers, key focus was really kind of job security. And then when it comes to things like attitude towards careers, there's very much a mindset of kind of, jobs for life, or your career is ultimately defined by your employer. But as we're moving over to kind of the right-hand side to Gen Y, which is millennial, and then also Gen Z, some of those kind of aspirations and attitudes towards careers are slightly changing, right? So we've got, from an aspiration perspective, millennial was very much about freedom and flexibility, whereas Gen Z are still, interested in those things, but also interested in having a sense of security and stability for like a variety of reasons. And then also when it comes to attitudes towards careers from like a Gen Z perspective, you may have heard things in the media of old Gen Z are renowned job hoppers. Whether I agree with that is a different topic. We may touch upon that, but ultimately they are more open to move between organizations more seamlessly. And the idea of a job for life is less of an appeal. And we'll discuss that in a little bit in a second. Obviously, these are broad generalizations, and not every single Gen Z individual you come across is going to fit into these boxes or is going to fit into some of the things we're talking about today. But this is just an overview to kind of help you understand how generations and things are changing. And I'm curious, actually, can anybody here see themselves or relate to any of these descriptors for your generation? If you can, please drop it in the comments, or the chat, I mean. Okay. Is that a yes or a no? I can't see anything in the chat. So we've got Laura, we've got definitely, as someone in Gen Z, security and stability is key for me. Does anybody else, maybe not in Gen Z, any kind of boomers or maturists or Gen X here, do you see any similarities in your aspirations or attitudes towards careers than in this graph? Cool. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so before we kind of dive into Gen Z, I think one thing that's really important to call out, and when I deliver these trainings and deliver these sessions, I always like to preface, is it's really important to come to sessions like this, or at least to listen to this session with an open mind, right? As I'm sure you probably noticed, that pretty much every day in the media, there is some kind of news article slating Gen Z left, right, and centre. I just pulled a few random ones here, but at the top we've got, Gen Z wants work lazy girl jobs. We've got contradictory one right below. boomers enjoy vacation whilst Gen Z feel guilty about taking vacation. We've got Gen Z workers are lazy and lack soft skills. There's all these articles constantly being thrown around by the media. And ultimately, whether we believe it or not, we are seeing these articles and they are then creating these unconscious biases in our head, which we are then unconsciously looking to validate at work, ultimately. So a lot of the time, or for some of the individuals or employers I speak to, certain behaviors will happen, or a person or an apprentice on their cohort will make a certain comment, and it's maybe a comment that they're not used to, or they don't know how to deal with, and instantly, it's really easy to fall back on the, oh, they're entitled thing, but realistically, that's pretty much based on all of these unconscious biases you're seeing in the media, which you're then proactively looking for reasons to validate at work, essentially. So it's really important to kind of be mindful of that throughout this presentation, but then also outside. And also just come to this with an open mind, essentially, and hopefully you may learn a thing or two. Okay, so let's jump into Gen Z quickly. So who are they? So in the UK, they're the youngest, most ethnically diverse generation in the UK. Diverse from an ethnicity perspective. They're also diverse from a kind of gender and sexual orientation perspective. They're also, everyone likes to say Gen Z are the digital natives, because what the years that they were born, so from 1997 onwards, they basically were born into technology and they grew up with technology. So a lot of them are tech savvy. However, not all of them. So super important to actually point out that I believe it's around 10.2 million people in the UK are currently digitally disconnected, which means they don't have internet access at home. So that's really important to remember, that actually not all of the young people, not all of the apprentices you're actually hiring into the organisation are going to be a typical tech savvy Gen Z, because some of them may not even have internet access at home, or some of them may have not grown up around technology because they may not have been able to afford it. And finally, their identity is hugely been shaped by things like the digital age, climate anxiety, COVID, etc., which we'll talk about in a second. But all of these things ultimately make them who they are today. And as a result of a lot of these things, in general, Gen Z are quite an anxious generation. So 7 in 10 have been diagnosed with a long-term mental health condition or are currently experiencing a short-term mental health condition. 6 in 10 have felt anxious about the environment in the past month. And half of them, when surveyed according to Deloitte, are currently living paycheck to paycheck, which is quite interesting. So lots of young people I'm speaking to, lots of kind of anxiety about the environment, and also anxiety around, the people that are in charge of making decisions with things regarding to the environment aren't actually going to be alive and be around when those decisions fall into play and see what happens. So that's a little bit frustrating. And especially, I think, living paycheck to paycheck from an apprenticeship perspective. I believe for a first year apprentice, the national minimum wage is about £5.80 or something, which works out around 20,000 or something a year. And I know that's only for a first year apprentice. Lots of companies pay more, but equally lots of companies will be paying the bare minimum. It's very expensive to live, especially if you're hiring a young person or an apprentice that has maybe relocated. They've not been able to manage their money before. When they do finally get that paycheck, if 70 to 80% of it is going on rent, and they then somehow have to figure out how they're gonna make the final 10 to 20% last for the rest of the month, if it's something they've never had to do before, that can actually create a lot of anxiety for a young person. Plus things like the lasting impacts of the pandemic. So a lot of the apprentices that you're hiring right now, they were kind of in like year 9 or 10 when COVID was happening. So typically around that age group where things like year 10 work experience, that was cancelled. So that's typically usually the first chance a young person in the UK has to at least experience work and a job. That was all cancelled. So a lot of these kind of formative experiences and formative things were put on hold. And obviously they did miss out on some of those potentially key skill building things. Oh, my mouse is going funny, sorry. And ultimately, for some of these young people, this anxiety is actually unfortunately showing up at work. So these are some of the key themes that we're seeing. So, devastation at, getting things wrong and messing up. So I was speaking to like a young person the other day, and they had an email to the wrong person. And to them, it was just the complete end of the world. And they fired, and they were really, really trying to come back from this thing, which to potentially to you and me is just like not a big deal. And things like lacking to meetings. Key pieces of feedback that I get from a lot of employers is, oh, my apprentices, they're joining virtual meetings. Sometimes the default is to an employer to think in their mind, okay, they're not interested, they're not motivated, when really a lot of the time it can actually potentially link back to that lack of confidence. They probably aren't used to putting their camera on. Not everybody has a workspace that they feel comfortable sharing. Not everyone has the luxury of a fancy home office that they can join from. They could be in a flat share with like 5 other people, and it could be a mess. So things like that. And then also scared to do things like ask questions, reach out to people, and even pick up the phone. And a lot of this is, ultimately can come back to anxiety as opposed to the default response of. In summary, what makes them tick? So I would kind of summarize it up to 4 things. Again, obviously, not every Gen Z fit into all of these, but in general, the generation are, very interested in making a positive impact on so when you are speaking to your apprentice, hugely recommend, seeking opportunities for them to get involved in the company. There's an option to give back, or even your kind of marketing and recruitment tools. How can you actually focus on, this role and what the impact this role is going to actually allow them to have on the kind of greater good, as opposed to this is the role and this is what you're doing. That's great, but for a young person that can seem very far off. So they want to know how they're actually making a contribution to the wider company, and then obviously like to wider society as a whole. I think Gen Z are really like into genuine, authentic connection. So, they wear what they want, they say what they want. They really do massively value genuine, authentic connection, and really do just want to be treated like a normal person, like an employee, essentially. And I think the third one is super important, a huge kind of desire to feel and look successful, which I think partly from what I'm seeing, conversations I've had, is partly obviously fueled by the likes of social media. There's quite toxic and quite controversial career content online. For example, I saw a video a few weeks ago of an American creator, which again, salaries in the US are much higher than they are in the UK. But obviously, a young person, they don't know that. So they'll be looking at this person in America who's the same age as them. Why are they earning so much more than me? That's not fair. So partly kind of fueled, I think, by unrealistic expectations set on social media, this feeling of feeling because COVID, years. So this constant feeling of, we've lost 2 years of our lives. We actually want to move. Definitely huge desire to want to be successful, and a huge desire to like want to progress in their career, but not necessarily knowing how to do that or how to actually navigate those conversations. So things will be said which, could be misconstrued as, this person's overly confident title, but really that's just they want to progress, but nobody's told them how to go about navigating those conversations. And then finally, really, value flexibility and independence, as we all do. And I think all of those things, they are more likely to be vocal about what they express their, which, if we're honest, I feel like we probably all wish we were a bit more like that, in general, if not only early on in our careers. Not super afraid to leave for more money or satisfaction because they have no choice. It's extremely expensive to live right now. And if you're in a job where you're constantly anxious about money, and then at the same time, you're not gaining satisfaction from the work you're doing, what choice do you have, right? They need to live. They need to, you know, be able to save up to do all these things. I can stay at the company for years. Just I think they've seen through parents, through layoffs that are constantly happening, that loyalty doesn't necessarily pay off in the long run. That doesn't mean to say if you hire an apprentice, they are not going to stay with the company for 4, 5, 6 years. That's definitely possible, as long as they are, you know, getting satisfaction and from the work they're doing and being compensated fairly, which ideally, realistically, is actually what we all want, right? So hopefully, from me going into some of those things, it's hopefully a little bit clearer that, you know what, these are actually young people that are really desperate to succeed. They have just not been taught how to go about that, essentially, and they need your help in doing that. But what they definitely aren't is lazy, uninterested in their career, and entitled. In fact, they're extremely motivated and to leave situations that no longer serve them, because in 2024, you know, you have no choice. Like, so hopefully that makes sense, and that gives a little bit of context to some of these things. I'm just going to pause for a quick drink. Okay. So now let's move on to the next section, which is around all things managing an apprentice, expectation versus reality. As I mentioned at the beginning, that a lot of the time you will have, you know, a preconceived idea of, you know, oh, I'm hiring, you know, for a 16-year-old, but oh, I'm hiring an 18-year-old, like they're an adult. Like, you know, chances are they've had a job before, or chances are they have some work experience, when that actually may not be the case. And everybody's different. So let's quickly touch upon what some of that expectation versus reality may actually look like. So I've got two sections. On the left is typically the assumptions that we sometimes have of like their life, and on the right is kind of in reality like what they actually really know when joining an organization. So what we think they know is maybe they'll have some basic experience of managing their time. Chances are they've had a full-time job or done some type of work experience maybe, or so that's what we think. We also think that, okay, you know, maybe they're a really tech-savvy generation. They'll be able to come into the organization, you know, be able to use the softwares we use. They'll be able to communicate via email. They'll be able to speak to clients. They'll be able to know how to work remotely, because that's what they did at school and college during COVID, right? But a lot of the time, the reality on the right side actually looks a lot different. So we've got 7 things here on the left. We've got 3 things here on the right. And some of these 3 things are kind of just maybes. So the reality is, yes, they may have some experience managing their time. For example, you know, if they've had a part-time job. However, apart from that, the reality is they've probably, you know, they've either just been attending school, sixth form or college, and that's been their main thing. And a lot of the time, the timekeeping aspect of that is largely dictated by teachers or largely dictated by parents. So chances are they don't actually probably really have that much experience managing their time, well, but most of them won't. Chances are, reality are, they may have a little bit of experience communicating with clients. If they've had some kind of, you know, part-time retail job, they may have had a little bit of experience. But the reality is, you know, serving somebody on the tills or stacking shelves in a part-time job that you're just doing for a little bit of extra money and not really 100% taking that seriously, a lot different to coming into the corporate world and actually having to speak to clients in a professional manner via email or in person. So it's very different. And finally, the reality is, from like a remote work perspective, chances are their experience working or studying remotely is going to be based on their COVID experience, which, if anyone here has children or saw in the news, you know, COVID just happened overnight. So schools really had to adapt super quickly. and the way that education was delivered wasn't ideal. And it is very different to the type of remote kind of hybrid work that they're going to be doing in the corporate world. So it's really important to kind of be realistic about these things. And if you are somebody that looks after apprentices in your organization, I think it's really important to be realistic to line managers in terms of, these are the things that they're actually going to need help with. Previously or sometimes, individuals in organizations, they'll be offered an apprentice and they'll just be like, oh yeah, I'll take one. Like, it's a pair of extra hands. Like, that's gonna be really great for me. And they don't actually fully understand the time and effort it's going to take to like train that person up. So when that does happen, they can feel a little bit, the manager can feel a little bit frustrated, or they can feel a little bit irritated. So it's really important to set those expectations with line managers if you're in charge of apprenticeships in your organizations, or if you are a line manager, it's really important to set those expectations with yourself that this is the reality. You're hiring a 16 or an 18-year-old who hasn't worked before, so they aren't going to know these things. So some of the kind of, we've touched upon this a little bit, but some of those kind of common examples of skill gaps, I'd say more kind of workplace readiness that I'm seeing, we've touched upon some of these, are kind of general office, etiquette. So things like how to write an email, how to manage their calendar. So there's been lots of feedback of people, like it's not something they would know, but for example, not accepting meetings or being invited to a meeting and neither accepting or declining. So that person on the other side has no idea if the apprentice is joining, or going out of office and not putting an out of office on, or not declining your meetings so that people are joining meetings when that individual's outside the office. So just little kind of general office etiquette things like that for sure. Not knowing how to use Outlook, Excel, etc. Things that seem like so simple to us, but really outside of work, there's not really, there's no use, you wouldn't have used these. Some of them may know how to use things like Word and Excel, but in terms of Outlook and calendar management, they probably won't have any experience doing that. I think the other two that are super important are not knowing how to deal with feedback and really taking it personally. That's a huge one that I'm hearing at the moment. And I think it makes sense. We talk about feedback in a little bit, but it makes sense. We are basically told from the second we start school that we cannot fail and we cannot get things wrong. And if we fail, if we badly at something, you're not going to have a future, you're not going to be able to get a job. And a lot of those fears and anxieties that are created can translate into the workplace when it comes to things like feedback. So we'll talk about that in a second. And I think finally, some other ones which I'm going to touch upon in a second are things like confidence, money management, and mental health, which aren't obviously entirely directly related to the work that they're going to be doing, but they are super important, right? So what's some of my tips for actually dealing with these? I think the first one that's really important is not to make assumptions, obviously about what they do and don't know, but also not to make assumptions about apprenticeship cohorts as a whole, because everybody's different. Some of them may have done work experience, some of them may not have done work experience, some of them may have come from disadvantaged backgrounds where they're really not used to using technology. So it's just really important to not make assumptions and get to know them. I would say the next one is super important is, make sure their basic needs are being met first. So things like money. So if you have an apprentice in your organization who behind the scenes is struggling with money, and they're being paid and 80% of their rent is 80% of their pay 80% of their wage is on rent, and then they're struggling to manage the rest, they're going to be anxious at work. They're not going to be able to perform in the same way that you'd like them to. On the flip side, if you have someone that's struggling with mental health, and they're struggling with anxiety at work, then they're not going to be able to show up in the way that they would like. They're not going to be able to join meetings and go on their camera, or they're not going to be able to join meetings and contribute because they're struggling with that anxiety. So it's all well and good thinking about, okay, how can we come and help them build their communication skills, or how can we teach them how to use this software? But thinking from it of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, if their basic needs aren't being met first, then it's going to be hard to those other skills. And I feel like a lot of employers aren't really considering things like money and mental health. So definitely those needs need to be met first. We've mentioned about helping them connect their broad vision to a broader vision of success. I think ultimately creating structures for providing support as well, as a young person probably isn't going to always feel confident enough, especially if they've just joined the organization. They're not going to necessarily feel confident enough to go to their manager and be like, oh, I don't understand this. Oh, can you help me with this? Because after a while, it feels like they're being annoying. So how can you actually create structures to provide them support? Things like open door policy, office hours, having it structured as part of your one-on-ones as a manager, or having it structured as part of your apprentice feedback as an apprenticeship lead at the company. How can you understand where they need support, because they aren't proactively very likely to ask for it, so you need to help them feel comfortable and provide areas for them too. And then finally, a lot of this is already done in apprenticeships, but I think the interesting point to call out is make training fun. Training is so boring. And I personally think the whole Gen Z have like a 5-second attention span is a myth personally, because Gen Z watch films, Gen Z watch TV shows. It's not that their attention span is short, it's that your content is boring. So really think about that. There are some really fun things you can do from like a training perspective. You can gamify things. I'm talking things like scavenger hunts, leaderboards, earning badges. We know from neuroscience that reward-based learning is a much bigger motivator than consequence-based learning. So really challenge you to think about how you can actually make it fun and enjoyable, instead of boring. And I think finally, just simply make time for them, especially from like a line manager perspective, or if you're someone that looks after apprenticeships at your organization, you want to make sure your line managers are actually making time for them. I cannot tell you how many apprentices I speak to that feel like a burden to their managers and feel like their managers don't have any time for them. And it's actually really sad, because a lot of them don't have the confidence to reach out to their manager directly, or they're scared of their manager. So it's really important to actually drill into managers that they need to make time for them. And apprentices aren't just like, something you can hire to palm off all the work that you don't want to do on, right? So I'm just going to stop for a drink, but we're going to move on to feedback in a second. So we're coming on to the last section of this webinar. I just wanted to quickly touch upon feedback. So Gen Z or young as a whole, I'd say they're not super comfortable with things like failure and feedback. Pretty much the reason I said before, we are you cannot fail. You need to learn everything. If you don't pass an exam, if you mess up at something, you're a failure and you've got no future. So a lot of this anxiety is coming into the workplace. And sometimes, especially when feedback is only given when it's around something that a piece of behavior or something you've seen that you don't like, sometimes them hearing, I've got feedback for you, can actually sound like, or translate in their heads to, you've done a bad job or you're in trouble. So I guess on my top feedback and dealing with that, the key is rebranding feedback. So I'm sure everyone knows here that good feedback when delivered is consistent and specific. So ideally, if there's something you want to deliver feedback month, should always be given from perspective. So I've noticed this, I've observed this, rather than right, because feedback is very subjective. It should be started with the positives, so something you have done, and then move on to the piece of feedback you're about to share. And then, especially from an apprentice perspective, it must include actions to work on and tips for improvement, as well as checkpoints for that. Because if you give someone feedback of something they could have done better at, or something, a piece of behavior you saw which you maybe didn't think was appropriate, what is a young person supposed to do with that feedback if you've given them no actions to work on, tips for improvement, or even a checkpoint of, when we should check in to see if a change has been made? So I think a lot of the time, are we giving good feedback? That's the first thing. Are we giving feedback in the right way? And are we setting the young person up for success to actually take that feedback on and make a change? Or are we just telling them we didn't like that they did something and leaving it there? So I think a bit more on the rebranding feedback perspective. So I think it's really important to actually change the conversation around what feedback means and its value, so that it doesn't actually have to be this scary thing that's only given when, somebody's done something wrong. Or so, really should be positioning feedback as something collectively as a team, which we all receive to improve. And as individuals, we want to improve. And feedback is the thing that helps us do that right. So how can we analyze it? How can we help rebrand it? Share stories of where you as an individual or you as a manager have been given feedback and explain how that was helpful for you. Integrate it into your staff meetings and welcome it into one-on-ones and increase its frequency. As a lot of the time, person, it can feel like, because they don't see it, they're the only person receiving feedback, which obviously is, but it, it, so even just asking them to provide feedback on things doing really well, and areas, areas you think that maybe, there could be some work on. That's again just like, yeah, about exactly what you expect and need from them from the very beginning, because as a young person, you don't know what you don't know. And from my work personally, I feel like so many frustrations amongst managers or, early careers teams when it comes to apprentices in terms of what they're doing, what they're not doing, what they should be doing, is actually because proper expectations haven't been set and nobody's actually ever told them what is expected of them. So there's frustration because they're not doing this thing, because they're, not showing up to a meeting on time, or because they're not putting their camera on. But them, actually, this is the recommended thing when you're joining a virtual meeting. It's a good thing to put your camera on because it shows that you're present, it helps with your communication. So I really want to highlight that. So I'm actually curious to see if anyone has an answer to this. What expectations do you set for your apprentice join organisation? Do you for them? And if you do, let me know in the chat and I'd love to read through them and share them. Does anyone set expectations? I can't see anything. To be honest, 90% of the time when I ask this question, no one says anything. Okay, so we've got expectations on how many days they should be shadowing on site. Absolutely. Anybody else? Does anyone else set any expectations? I'm going to give it a minute or so to see. Okay, but ultimately, I'm guessing, we've got, yes, we provide guidance on meeting management etiquette, using Office 365, use of emails for updates and calendars, etc., dress code. Okay, so we've got a couple expectations, but in general, I don't know if I should interpret the silence as you don't want to share or you don't set expectations. But ultimately, if you are someone sitting here that can't think of any, then really you're not in a position to, you know, moan about what they should be doing or should not be doing if you've not actually set that expectation from the get-go. So I've just got pretty much a laundry list here of things that you really need to be super clear on from day one to make sure that you're for success. Again, this is a little bit of a laundry list. It's not everything, but some ones that I think are really super important are, you know, when they first join, setting focuses for the first week, month, and quarter, and checkpoints between those to make sure they're on track. Let them know who on the team they should meet with or reach out to. And actually, the best way to do this, because coming back to that confidence piece, for you and me, if I told you, oh, you need to go and introduce yourself to this person, I'd go and do it. But for a young person that hasn't actually worked before, you know, they've got so many options. Should they email this person? Should they Teams them? Should they phone them? Should they text them? So it's like, what's the actual best way to go about it from your perspective? That will really help them out. Walk them through their calendar and explain any teams or reoccurring meetings they need to attend. Expectations of them whilst attending. So are they expected to just sit there and listen? Are they expected to contribute? Are they expected to write notes? Again, we can't really complain about what they are or not doing if we've not actually set that expectation because they don't know. Outline how often you'll meet with them one-on-one and who's going to be responsible for driving the agenda. Share your preferred communication method. So if you are managing someone, how to be contact and text call. Oh, I got some chats here. Commitment to the apprenticeship and expectations of us provided. Yep, that's a really good expectation. Obviously things like walk through an office. I think again, discuss how progression works, expected timeframes and behaviours. So again, obviously between employers that may vary, and depending on like what apprenticeship you're doing, that of course also varies. But again, when there are sometimes there's complaints or worries from employers that they're getting they're getting I've lost my train of thought. They're getting comments from their apprentices of, oh, you know, they've finished this and they're desperate to move on to the next thing, or oh, it seems like they want to walk before they can run, kind of thing. Well, ultimately, we can't really complain that they want to move on if it's actually progression and all that hasn't been, well as the behaviours they need to be demonstrating are explained to them. So yeah, this is probably my laundry list of expectations. This isn't all of them, but hopefully some of these may be useful to you. Okay, and then we are just coming on to the end of the session and we'll have some time for questions if anybody has any. So let's just recap what we've learned. So I think ultimately at work, Gen Z expect to learn aren't getting one or the other, then they're not afraid to stick around. They're hugely motivated to progress, but often don't actually know what to do. They get promoted in 6 months, or they know they want to finish their apprenticeship early or whatever, but they don't often know how to actually go about that and have those conversations. So it's really important to, you know, set those expectations so that they can demonstrate correct behavior and they know what is actually expected of them. What you think they know versus what they actually know sometimes looks a little bit different. So really focus on getting to know them, and don't assume. Finally, I think feedback is scary to them, but it doesn't really have to be. So, and then I think finally, I'm hoping you've noticed, but ultimately we're actually all more alike than we think. We all want the same thing. We all want to be paid fairly, to enjoy the work we're doing, right? And that doesn't really differ between generations. We just have different ways of expressing it and different ways of going about it. Okay, and yes, that is the end. So if anybody has any questions, we've got about a couple minutes for questions. So I'm just going to have a pause and see if any come through.
No.
Okay. I'm all curious to know whether others set expectations during the recruitment onboarding process. So I'm guessing that's more of a question to like everybody else in the chat. So feel free to, if you're listening, I drop Jonathan a response to his question on whether others set expectations during the recruitment onboarding process. Okay, so we've got a question. If you set expectations and the individual just still does not meet those even after feedback, how do you go about that? Good question. I think definitely, you know, definitely key is to try and like understand things from their perspective rather than going in on the, it's very easy as humans, we all have a tendency to expect the worst. If you're telling someone to do something and they're continuously ignoring it, why are they ignoring it? And you can really have a tendency to kind of go in there with the negatives and tell them off effectively. But I recommend just kind of understanding things from their perspective. So asking them, for example, if somebody's, I don't know, consistently late to meetings and you've spoken to them before and you've set the expectation, that expectation is you need to be, I don't know, either 5 minutes early or bang on the dot. And if they still aren't showing up, I would ask them, is there a reason that you're still not able to turn up for meetings? Because there could be a reason that you don't know about, right? They could be someone that's neurodivergent and struggle with managing their time. They could have an ill family member that they're having to look after till late at night and then they're waking up late. There's just a multitude of reasons. So definitely trying to understand from their perspective and asking rather than like accusing or assuming is definitely key. And then obviously based on what they're saying, move on from there. So if they were like, do you know what? I really struggle with managing my time. Obviously you could be like, okay, how can I support you with this? Would it make sense for us to work together to block out some time in between meetings on your calendar so that you have at least a 10-minute break between meetings so that you'll have that time to move on. Can we help prioritize your day better? So definitely try to understand and then help work with them as opposed to like assuming the worst and assuming they're being annoying or not interested, because it may not be the case. We've got, would be great to get other Gen Zs more established in the workplace or apprentices further along to mentor buddy them. How do you improve their confidence? Yeah, so obviously loaded question, but I think obviously confidence naturally improves as somebody gets further into their apprenticeship journey. So obviously confidence is probably not likely to be that strong at the beginning. However, as time goes on and if they're working around the right people and if they're challenged, then confidence is naturally going to grow. There are a range of things that can be done and a range of different activities that I could potentially talk through. But yeah, I think just there's various different things that can be done, but definitely like it's natural for them not to be super confident at the beginning. If 6 months to a year down the line, confidence still isn't there, then I would definitely recommend looking into some like workshops or some coaching or things like that. I run a bunch of sessions on confidence and imposter syndrome for young people. So if you'd be interested, message me afterwards. Okay, and I'm going to give a minute or so to see if anyone else has any questions.
Just to add to that as well, we are going to be sending out an email later this week or early next week with details of everything that Shoshanna offers and where you can kind of get in touch with her. So keep an eye out for that as well. And obviously, if you would like to have any of the amazing services that Shoshanna offers, then you can get in touch with her through that as well.
Okay, I think that is all the questions. So yeah, it looks like we can all take 5 minutes back and enjoy the rest of our week. So thank you very much everyone for joining. I hope this was at least somewhat interesting to you. And yeah, happy to answer any questions you have directly. I've got my LinkedIn QR code there, so give it a scan. I post lots of content around all things Gen Z, early careers, confidence, etc. on LinkedIn. So if you're interested, please feel free to connect with me.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Shoshanna. And I follow Shoshanna on LinkedIn, and she does post loads of fab content. So make sure you do have a look if it's something that definitely is of interest, which it seems like it certainly is, because everybody's saying thank you and that they found it really interesting. So I'm really, really glad you all enjoyed it. But yeah, as I said, an email will be going out with details of how you can contact Shoshanna throughout the week. And yeah, just a massive thank you, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks, everyone.